All right, so we just finished contextualizing the 18th century. It was a really quick video. Now we're going to look at the 18th century British ascendancy. Remember that word ascendancy means the rise, and really by the time we finish this lecture, we're going to understand that Great Britain by 1800 is the greatest empire in the world. It's going to dominate so many different things, and it's all because of the events that we've already covered, but really they become much more quickly developing during this century. We've already mentioned a little bit about the economics, but so let's go and jump in here. All right. So the 18th century British ascendancy, it really begins with the Glorious Revolution, 1688. We have a constitutional monarchy, English Bill of Rights, Toleration Act, Act of Settlement, Act of Union. All of those things really kind of wrapped up. We have a constitutional government, constitutional monarchy, and the birth of what we know as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It is now set and ready to launch. The modern parliamentary system is really beginning to develop thanks to the English Bill of Rights. The Parliament's able to meet, it's going to convene, there's regular meetings. Members of Parliament are going to have the power over really the king in many ways. The British Royal Society and scientific becomes the scientific leader that England is really transforming. I think of 1689 with the publications of Locke's Second Treatise on Government as well as Newton's Principia. We begin to see how Great Britain is philosophically a century ahead of everyone, that the rationale and understandings of how Great Britain is going to move forward are really set, not just in political, but also science. I think it's also important for you to remember merchants are financing the science. They believe theoretical science will eventually have a practicality, and we've already seen a little bit of that with the mechanization of cotton industry. And we begin to see the beginnings of the development of capitalism. We begin to see the elements during this century. We begin to see bonds and banknotes. We begin to see more access to freedom of trade and the industrialization. So all of this is really beginning to happen throughout the 18th century. That really 1715 Britain and France are almost equal in power. Maybe even France is more powerful. By the time we get to 1763, the world has changed. So let's jump in. What is this Great Britain in Parliament? The Great Britain, when we think about it, there's you have a two-chamber Parliament, very similar to our Congress, and the two chambers include the House of Lords, which are the peers. The peers are those uppity type of nobility who think who don't stink. They really think that they're great, ginormous. They live on privilege. Now, with that said, I want to point out the House of Lords is not corrupt. It's always been established for them. The second body is the one that's corrupt, the House of Commons. The House of Commons is supposed to represent the common people. But I want to tell you, the boroughs or voting districts have not changed for centuries. And this is why the gentry how they're going to be able to maintain their power. The gentry, we already know who the gentry are. We've talked about them in the English Civil War. We know that they wanted to be nobility, but they were never going to be allowed to become there. So their only privilege is to hold on to power within the idea of Parliament. And with that said, in some ways, the gentry are going to be more reactionary than the lords because they have more to lose. Now, pocket boroughs. The word borough is voting districts. These boroughs have not changed. What the pocket boroughs are these voting districts that are in the rural areas that no longer reflect the population distribution. Let's just say this. You have a rural village that was one of the most populated villages in England in 1300. So they get two members of parliament, two people going to the House of Commons. Well, since 1300, there's been rapid urbanization. So what has happened to that borough? Most likely that borough has become underpopulated. Thanks to the first and second enclosure movement, people are being forced to move into the urban areas. But those pocket boroughs don't change their boundaries. So therefore, the gentry, they may have Two, the village may have been one time 50,000 people with two members of the House of Commons. Now it might be 20 people in that. And they're all related. And what do? They vote for the same guy. So that borough is, quote unquote, in their pocket, which means they're never going to lose power. The urban area is going to be underrepresented. Um, a city like Manchester only had one member of parliament. Well, let's put that in this perspective. House of Commons is supposed to equally represent the common people. Well, at this moment, the common people are only the gentry. So anybody that's not gentry or nobility, they have zero voice in Congress. They don't, or Parliament. They don't vote. There's no representative for them to go to. And these pocket boroughs in the rural, or you may have a borough of 20 people with two voices in Parliament, whereas Manchester, they may have 290,000, but they still hold on to one voice. So one voice for 290,000 people versus two voices for 20 people. I hope you can see that this is a corrupt system, but the problem is Parliament had to make changes, and Parliament didn't want to make changes because the gentry were in power. Now, the modern parliamentary system is finalized with the Hanoverian dynasty, with George I and George II not able to speak English and not caring about the English development. They begin to identify a key leader. They have an advisor in Parliament called the Prime Minister. That Prime Minister is born in 1720, and we're going to begin to identify the evolution of that position. Eventually, that Prime Minister unseats the king as the executive leader. Now, let's jump in. Robert Walpole, he's the first prime minister. He is the prime minister that served under George I and George II. He starts in 1720 and he leads all the way to 1740. He's a pretty powerful guy. And as the first prime minister, he established key precedents or precedents. Presidents, these are kind of like what President Washington set as the first president, these examples to be followed by ever. And we're going to talk about two. The first one, let sleeping dogs lie. That's the foreign policy. He established a principle that England should ignore the continent unless the continent's bothering it. Let sleeping dogs lie. He wanted to reduce the amount of war. It's not surprising out of his self-interest because he, as a gentry, he wanted to keep property taxes low so they can maintain their privilege of their land. So we begin to see that. Again, gentry interests. Fortunately, this interest is going to serve everyone. Nobody really wants to go to war. Now, the economic policy. The economic policy, he established a precedent that Parliament protected the economy. Remember, this is about 60 years before Adam Smith writes his Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith, 60 years later, writes that one of the jobs of the government is to maintain the currency. Well, this is where it started. It's called the South Sea Bubble. And please give me a few seconds to help explain it. All right. It starts with the South Sea Company. The South Sea Company was a joint stock company established by Parliament to oversee the Pacific colonies, these islands. The islands produced no product. And without producing wealth, what's the profit going to be? Of course, it's not going to be anything. But the South Sea Company thinks they can develop, so the leaders, supported by Parliament, create this joint stock company. Well, every joint stock company wants capital, so what do? They do a first sell of stock. And the members of Parliament and their friends are able to buy stock at a certain price. Let's just pretend it's 10 pounds per share. Well, once they inject the South Sea Company with capital, that bullion, they get their stocks. What happens to those value of the stocks? Of course, they begin to rise, so almost immediately my 10 pounds becomes 20 pounds. And then they have a second sell to the regular people, the townspeople, the burghers. And all of a sudden, people are like, wait a minute, we can turn our hard bullion into shares of this company and get this great return. So boom, they begin to invest. Well, as they buy their stocks at, let's say now the value is $20, 30 pounds, 40 pounds, they're buying all this stock and they're hoping that the the value is going to continue to rise. The problem is, what's the company producing? Nothing. So in Parliament one day, they were all talking, and the members of Parliament realized, because they have inside knowledge, that the company was about to crash. They were producing nothing. There was no income. So before it crashed and their value of their stocks go down, they cashed in their stocks. So they may have invested at £10. Now they're getting £1,000 because all that bullion was there, and it's worth this. They pull that out, and what happens to the company? The company now no longer has access to bullion or capital, and all these people who have these other shares, they think they're valuable. They go from, we purchased at £100, now they're worth £10. What happens to their wealth? Collapses. That's the bubble. It's when the speculators, members of Parliament, early in they invest, they watch the values of stock go up. When they feel that they're peaking, they withdraw with all that profit, causing the company to lose everything and causing people to lose everything. So are the average people going to trust Parliament any longer? Of course not. They're mad at Parliament. The members of Parliament have used their privilege to enrich themselves at our cost. That's when Robert Walpole, who never really supported the company, said, enough's enough. And he forced Parliament to insure the losses. So what that means is, if I invested £100, I get £100 back. It doesn't matter where that value ended up going or not going. I'm going to be protected. Because of that, a decade later, the people of England trusted trusted Parliament, and they trusted the British economy. And that's when we begin to see the commercial revolution. So it's a really important element. The South Sea Company could have been devastating, but instead, Robert Walpole sets the precedent that Parliament will protect the economy. So with that said, he's ruling with a gentry point of view. It is self-interest. He wants no war. He wants a protected economy. But in the end, it benefited all of Britain. That's going to be very different than the self-interest in France, and we'll see that later. Now, 1740, the War of Austrian Succession begins. The sleeping dog is no longer sleeping. So Robert Walpole, frustrated, is kind of forced out of, and we eventually, a couple years later, give rise to William Pitt the Elder. There are several prime ministers in between them. Who cares about them? We're looking at the highlights. William Pitt Elder was the most powerful prime minister, really, of this time period, 1760s. He is, during the worst years of the 7 Years' War, he is the one that convinces Parliament that this is a war for empire. So they fully fund the invasion of India. They fully fund the North American aspect. We know that's true because when George Washington captured Lewisburg in what we know as Pennsylvania, they converted that city into Pittsburgh in his honor. So he's really a hero. He becomes a national figure in Britain and the British Empire, and not surprisingly, George III begins to become challenged and jealous. He begins to realize, if William Pitt the Elder becomes the national figure, what do they need with a king? So what he does, he decides to sack him. He fires Pitt at the height of the 7 Years' War in hopes to restore that lost monarchical power. He realizes his father and grandfather really had caused chaos because they never really wanted to learn English, and now he's attempting to regain the lost elements. But now what do we see? Who does he place? He replaces Pitt with Lord Bute. Lord Bute is a really important guy. He is not a member of the House of Commons, but a member of the House of Lords. And really the reason he does this, George III does this, is because he believes that Lord Bute and George have the same values. They're so conservative. They're going to hold on. They're going to help restore not only his liberties but the nobility. This is the high point of the aristocratic resurgence in England. This is the moment in which they passed the Fishing and Game Act. But remember, we're also at the moment of this massive urbanization. This is the 1770s and 1780s. The 1770s, the colonies are cut off. No longer are urban dwellers able to get there. We begin to see London really becoming large. Manchester is surging to 200,000 by this time, and there's really nothing being done. That's when a guy named John Wilkes comes in. John Wilkes, yes, John Wilkes Booth was named after him. John Wilkes is a rebel, an urban leader. He was a newspaper publisher that called for electoral reform. Electoral reform means redistributing the boroughs. He thinks the pocket boroughs are the devil, that the gentry are holding back progress. This is not natural. Think about Enlightenment. And he's right. We know that the urban areas are in desperate need for change, but the lords don't know about it. The gentry don't know about it. So therefore, all of Parliament don't. So they need electoral reform. He begins to utilize this concept of liberty, demanding that Parliament provides the urban dwellers liberty, which is electoral reform. We deserve a vote. And that's when we begin to get this pressure. I like this political cartoon. This is a conservative view of Wilkes. Does everybody see he looks like Satan there? You see his horns. I also want to call attention to this, the Liberty Cup. Most people during this time period had a thing called a Liberty Cup. Most men, educated men, they were a pewtered cup. It was like supposed to represent the enlightened values, not sure. They called it the Liberty Cup. Here we call it the Jefferson Cup, which I think I just said. But look at that cup. You might say, wow, so it's upside down. But is it? No. It's right side up because you can see by the word. But what is he saying? They're saying, as he raises that concept of liberty, what does it hold? Nothing. They begin to talk about him becoming a demagogue, a leader who plays on people's emotions to achieve the goal. Now, I don't believe he was a demagogue. I believe he really wanted urban reform. But when he got elected to Parliament through the City of London, Parliament refused to seat him. So in fear of an all-out revolution, George III sacks Bute. So Bute is gone. Wilkes is gone. And now the urban dwellers at least feel maybe progress maybe gotten back. And that's when we get William Pitt the Younger. He's both the youngest and longest serving member of Prime Minister ever. He was in his 20s when he was appointed, and he will be there until his death. Hoping to restore the stability, George III appointed William Pitt the Younger, the son of Pitt the Elder. Pitt, this guy, he's going to oversee the stabilization of Great Britain during the loss of the 13 colonies. And think about that. Think about the wealth that the 13 colonies generated. Gone. You feel like England would collapse. No, William Pitt the Younger is able to be successful. And once they begin to recover, that's when the wars of the French Revolution occur. 1790s, all of Europe is in a blazed in war. And William Pitt is able to manage that. He does that all the way to the rise of Napoleon. He was extremely popular with the nobility, gentry, and burghers. And because of that, he was able to push off electoral reform. Because he was so popular, because he was so successful, there was no need for electoral reform. That electoral reform that is desperately needed will not take effect until 1832. We'll see that later next semester. Now, as we conclude, the 18th century British Parliament, clearly better than absolutism. There is the arbitrariness of the divine right gone. This is the social contract theory of Locke. We know that having a representative body has more voices, more perspectives. But Parliament was still corrupt. It was not the House of Lords. We may not like the House of Lords, but it was doing what it was supposed to do. But the House of Commons resisted any type of change. Those pocket boroughs really empowered the gentry. But with that said, it ushers a time period in which I will talk, this is a WASP term, evolution, not revolution. When things begin to challenge Great Britain, there is a mechanism in place with Parliament that they will be able to work out the details. And if we're able to see this evolution and not revolution, it's really going to help Great Britain emerge as the greatest country in the world. I hope that makes sense to y'all.